I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
A note before we begin. You may have seen videos claiming Ronstadt named 7 musicians she hated, full of invented backstage fights, fabricated quotes, and stage betrayals involving Don Henley, Jim Morrison, Neil Young, Frank Zappa, David Crosby, Elvis Costello, and Paul Simon. None of that is documented anywhere. Not in her 2013 memoir, Simple Dreams. Not in any interview. Not in any biography. This script tells the real story instead. The actual well-documented relationships, romances, and creative partnerships that defined one of the most remarkable careers in American music. She was the voice that could silence a stadium, and also the voice that could turn on a dime from rock to country to opera to the mariachi songs her father sang to her as a child. Linda Ronstadt sold more than 100 million records, won 11 Grammys, and spent the 1970s as the best-selling female recording artist in the country. But the story that rarely gets told with any accuracy is the one about the people she made music with and loved and fought for and stood beside along the way. This is that story, built from her own memoir, her interviews, and the documented history of the Los Angeles music scene she helped create. Before the Eagles filled stadiums, Don Henley and Glenn Frey were 2 unknown musicians trying to find their footing in Los Angeles. In 1971, Linda Ronstadt needed a backing band for an upcoming tour, and her producer at the time, John Boylan, went to work assembling one. Henley had already sent Boylan some songs he'd written, hoping to catch Ronstadt's attention as a songwriter. The songs weren't right for her records, but Boylan liked what he heard in the writer, and Henley and Frey both ended up in her touring band, alongside Randy Meisner and Bernie Leadon. That lineup became the incubator for one of the most successful rock bands in history. Ronstadt herself has spoken about it warmly and without bitterness. In her memoir and in interviews given around his 2013 publication, she described Boylan as the connective tissue who brought these musicians into her orbit in the first place, and she recalled the tour as a formative season for everyone involved, including her. She didn't try to hold onto Henley and Frey when they decided to strike out on their own by the end of 1971. By 1973, the Eagles had Take It Easy on the radio, Desperado, One of These Nights, and eventually Hotel California followed in short order, turning Ronstadt's former backing musicians into stadium headliners in their own right. What's often missed is that Ronstadt and the Eagles didn't drift apart after that. They kept crossing paths as friends and collaborators for years. In 1975, she performed live shows with the band, and she sang lead on their song Desperado during some of those joint performances. There's no documented rift, no revoked backstage passes, no bitter interview in which Henley dismissed her sound as safe or too polished. What exists instead is a Billboard interview from 2016, published after Glenn Frey's death, in which Ronstadt spoke fondly and specifically about Boylan's role in bringing the future Eagles into her band. The kind of detail you volunteer about people you still think well of, not people you've cut out of your life. The truth of this story doesn't need embellishing to be compelling. A rising female artist, still finding her own footing in a male-dominated industry, gave 2 struggling musicians a stage, a paycheck, and a professional network, and then let them go, without ego, to build something enormous. That's not a betrayal story. It's a generosity story. And it says something genuine about who Ronstadt was at 25 years old, with her own career just beginning to take off. Of all the musicians who passed through Ronstadt's life, few left as lasting a creative mark as singer-songwriter J.D. Souther. They became a couple in the early 1970s, meeting as Souther was rising alongside the same Troubadour Club crowd that included Jackson Browne, the future members of the Eagles, and a young manager named David Geffen. Their romance didn't last, but their musical partnership did, in a sense, for decades. Souther wrote or co-wrote some of the material most associated with Ronstadt's peak years, including Faithless Love, a song that became one of her signature ballads. Listeners and critics have long noted the particular ache in her performances of Souther songs, the sense that she was singing something closer to autobiography than interpretation. He also went on to write hits for the Eagles, including Best of My Love and Heartache Tonight, which meant that Ronstadt's early band, her former boyfriend, and her own recording career were all, at different points, running through the same small circle of songwriters and session players who gathered at the Troubadour on any given night in the early 70s. Their relationship ended, as many young relationships do, but it didn't end the way tabloid feud videos want you to believe these things always end, with a lawsuit, a diss track, or a screaming match caught by a photographer. By most accounts, they remained on good terms and continued to appear in each other's professional orbit for years afterward, right up until Souther's death in 2021. Ronstadt has spoken about him in interviews with real tenderness, describing the LA singer-songwriter scene of that era as a tight, competitive, but ultimately supportive community, one where former lovers could still trust each other's ears in a recording session. In the mid to late 1970s, Ronstadt's most publicly scrutinized relationship wasn't with a musician at all. It was with California Governor Jerry Brown. The pairing was, by any measure, one of the strangest and most talked-about celebrity romances of the decade. The reigning queen of country rock, at the absolute commercial peak of her career, dating the sitting governor of the nation's largest state. She was, for a stretch of years, effectively living at the governor's residence in Sacramento while headlining arena tours and topping the Billboard charts. The relationship drew constant tabloid attention and no shortage of skepticism from people who assumed it was some kind of publicity arrangement rather than a real partnership. It wasn't. The two dated for several years, broke up as most long relationships eventually do. And this is the detail that never makes it into the manufactured feud version of Ronstadt's biography. Remained genuinely close friends for the rest of Brown's life. When Brown died in 2018, those who'd followed the relationship for 40 years understood it as one of the more durable and least dramatic of her adult relationships, even though it had unfolded almost entirely in public view. It's worth pausing on this, because it says something about Ronstadt's actual temperament, as opposed to the temperament assigned to her in clickbait retellings. She was, by nearly every account from people who worked and lived alongside her, someone who didn't need to burn a relationship down when it ended. She let people go the way she'd let Henley and Fry go a few years earlier, without spectacle. If you want to understand what real, sustained creative partnership looked like in Ronstadt's life, look at her decades-long friendship with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris. The three women were already close friends and mutual admirers by the mid-1970s, and they've been quietly trying to find time to record together since almost that early. But three overlapping, enormously demanding solo careers made scheduling a shared album nearly impossible for years. They got their first chance to perform together on television during the taping of Dolly Parton's short-lived variety show in the mid-1970s, and pieces of the material they worked on together during that period later surfaced on their individual solo albums. It wasn't until 1987 that the three finally managed to align their calendars long enough to release Trio, a country album that became one of the most celebrated collaborative records in the genre's history. It won the Academy of Country Music's Album of the Year, the Country Music Association's Vocal Event of the Year, and a Grammy for Best Country Performance by a Duo or Group, while also earning a nomination for the All-Genre Album of the Year, a rare feat for a country record at the time. It went platinum. A sequel, Trio 2, followed in 1999, and the two records were eventually combined into the complete Trio collection in 2016. What makes this story different from every fabricated feud narrative is that there's no tension to manufacture here, because the friendship was the whole point. Harris and Ronstadt in particular had been trading harmony vocals and swapping songs with each other since the early 70s. Ronstadt covered material connected to Harris's circle, and the two lent each other credibility and audiences at different points in careers that moved in and out of the same country rock orbit. Parton has spoken about the trio's chemistry as something built on mutual respect between three women who each, in their own genre, had to fight to be taken seriously as artists rather than just voices. None of them needed to compete with each other, because none of them were chasing the same thing. By the early 1980s, Ronstadt was a reigning female voice of American rock and roll, and she chose at the height of that fame to walk away from it at least for a few years and record an album of pre-rock American standards with veteran arranger Nelson Riddle, the man best known for shaping Frank Sinatra's most iconic recordings in the 1950s. It was a genuinely risky move, and by her own account and her labels, not a popular one at first. Both her record company and her longtime manager, Peter Asher, were reportedly reluctant to back the project, worried that a rock star pivoting to Gershwin and Rogers and Hart standards would confuse her audience or flop outright. Ronstadt pushed the idea through anyway. Riddle, for his part, didn't initially know much about her or her music. He'd built his entire career on the pre-rock pop era and had watched rock and roll push that kind of orchestral songcraft to the margins of the industry. Ronstadt has said she wanted to help rescue those songs. She once called them little jewels of artistic expression, from being permanently relegated to elevator music. The gamble paid off in a way few people expected. The resulting 1983 album, What's New?, spent 81 weeks on the Billboard chart and became the first of 3 consecutive platinum-selling collaborations between Ronstadt and Riddle, followed by Lush Life in 1984 and For Sentimental Reasons in 1985, the latter completed after Riddle's death partway through the sessions. Riddle posthumously won a Grammy for his arrangement work on the title track of Lush Life. Decades later, when Ronstadt donated Riddle's original handwritten orchestral charts to the University of Arizona School of Music, she told a local reporter that she considered the legacy of those recordings to belong entirely to Riddle, a strikingly generous thing for an artist to say about a body of work that had, in commercial terms, been entirely her own risk to take. This is, again, the opposite of a betrayal story. It's a story about an artist who trusted an older, wary collaborator enough to talk him into a project neither his career nor hers obviously needed, and who came out the other side crediting him for it rather than herself. In the late 1980s, Ronstadt found one of the most commercially and emotionally resonant partnerships of her career with New Orleans soul singer Aaron Neville. The two recorded a string of hit duets together, and for a period the press treated them, in the language of the time, as the reigning first couple of pop music, a phrase used by Entertainment Weekly to describe just how completely their voices and their public partnership had captured audiences. Their romantic relationship developed alongside the musical one, and while it didn't last as a couple, the professional partnership and mutual respect endured well beyond the romance. Their recordings together remain some of the most enduringly popular material in either artist catalog, and neither has spoken publicly about the collaboration with anything but warmth in the years since. It stands as one more example of the pattern that runs through Ronstadt's actual biography: intense creative and personal partnerships that came, ran their course, and ended, without the kind of scorched earth aftermath that clickbait retellings of her life like to invent. None of the relationships above happened in isolation. They all trace back to a specific place and a specific window of time: the Troubadour Club in West Hollywood, starting around 1970, where Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, J.D. Souther, Bernie Leadon, and a rotating cast of session players and songwriters more or less lived on any given week. It was there, in the spring of 1970, that Ronstadt also met a young manager named David Geffen, who would go on to have an outsized and lasting influence on her career and on the broader Los Angeles music industry. The scene has been documented at length in books like Hotel California, which chronicles the interlocking careers of Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Jackson Browne, Ronstadt, Geffen, and the Eagles as one continuous, overlapping social and musical ecosystem rather than a series of separate, competing camps. What comes through clearly in that history, and in Ronstadt's own recollections, is that the troubadour scene ran on a kind of professional intimacy that's hard to imagine in the modern music industry. Today's opening act was tomorrow's headliner. Today's backing musician was next year's platinum-selling songwriter. And today's romantic partner was often tomorrow's most trusted collaborator in the studio. That's the real texture of the story that gets flattened into a feud list by channels chasing clicks. The actual history of Ronstadt's musical relationships isn't a string of betrayals. It's a portrait of an unusually close, unusually overlapping community of artists who kept working together, dating each other, breaking up, and then showing up in each other's studios again a few years later, because the trust and the talent were both real. In 2013, Ronstadt revealed that she had been diagnosed with a condition, later specified as progressive supranuclear palsy related to Parkinson's disease symptoms, that had ended her ability to sing. It was a difficult and very public loss for an artist whose voice had been her entire instrument and identity for 4 decades. But rather than retreating from the story of her career, she spent the years since writing about it, publishing Simple Dreams, a musical memoir the same year of her diagnosis reveal, and Later Feels Like Home, a song for the Sonoran borderlands, an exploration of the Mexican heritage and borderland culture that shaped her earliest musical memories, growing up in Tucson, listening to her father's mariachi records. In 2021, a documentary about her life and career, Linda Ronstadt, The Sound of My Voice, won a Grammy. In 2022, the city of Tucson renamed its music hall in her honor. And in July of 2026, she celebrated her 80th birthday as one of the most decorated and genuinely beloved figures in the history of American popular music. A woman who moved fluidly between rock, country, opera, big band standards, and traditional Mexican folk songs, and who did it all while maintaining relationships with the people she made that music alongside that were, by the substantial written and recorded record she left behind, marked far more by loyalty and mutual respect than by any of the manufactured grudges attributed to her online. The real story of Linda Ronstadt and the musicians in her life isn't a story about 7 people she hated. It's a story about the Troubadour Club, a producer named John Boylan, a governor's mansion in Sacramento, 3 women who kept trying for over a decade to make one record together, and an aging arranger who didn't know her music but trusted her enough to try something new anyway. It's a better story than the invented one, not because it's tidier, but because it's true, and because it says something real about what it actually takes to build a career and a life in music, not the absence of conflict, but the presence, again and again, of people willing to trust each other enough to make something lasting together. Thanks for watching. If you'd like more accurate, deeply researched looks at the real history behind the music you love, subscribe for more.